Good morning, non-Western art appreciation class. I hope today you are doing fantastically well. Today we'll be studying the amazing oceanic cultures of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. And today really focusing on Polynesia and the triangle that makes up the triangle of the Easter Islands to Hawaii over to New Zealand. And we'll be looking at kind of these ocean-going, seafaring voyages, which are quite amazing. Now, the first thing we have to ask is why would we want to study this particular area of the world? What have they actually done for us? And so one of the things that shows up is that as we look in this larger area, and we'll also be talking a little bit about Australia, even though it's slightly out of this area, is that as we look at the Aborigines, they do create the oldest culture, the oldest living culture that we have on Earth that goes back nearly, and again, estimates, 15 to 20,000 years. The concept of taboo, those things that are ritually not allowed, that we actually have the word from taboo, it has come from here. They come up with the first human rights law ever, the law of the splintered paddle, that you should not harm people in combat that are non-combatants. They're going to have a gift culture exchange, and it's pretty cool that we'll have to talk about. And finally, one of our states is actually our 50th state, Hawaii, is a Polynesian culture. So we should know something about our own people that live in our country. When we look at the world map, you'll note Polynesia is spread out basically all throughout the Pacific Ocean. And so you'll note there's almost all blue and very little land. The land mass outside of Australia here that we're looking at is really very tiny, the size of just the northeastern United States. And it's spread out over a very limited population as well. Less than 1% of the world's population. Now, this is not the only map that we have. This lovely one, this is kind of North-centric. If you look at an Australian map where Australia puts itself in the middle, notice here are the islands that show up. And this is an actual Australian map showing an area of the world if it was flattened for the Australian projection rather than for the northern projection where most people live. One of the amazing things that shows up in this area of the world, this is the KULA social gift and bonding people together exchange. So it's called the KULA exchange. It's what social media can do if used wisely, and this is done as a gift exchange. It's pretty amazing. So what happens with the KULA ring, it basically bonds people and families, entire communities together, because you have two different items of decoration that are going two different directions. So you have red shell necklaces here, and you have white shell armbands. And so as you can see, the arm shells are going in this direction, that red direction here. And the KULA necklace is going in the opposite direction. And so you're constantly crossing paths and trading. And so the person who traded with you before becomes the person you want to trade with in the future. And so it binds communities together. If someone misbehaves, then you cut that person off and you no longer give a, so it's a way of social punishment in a place that doesn't have a court system. So it's pretty amazing. And so here's Malinowski, the leading research in all of Polynesia on the KULA exchange.
Malinowski found one of his most important examples of the rational function behind a seemingly irrational behavior in the Trobriand custom known as the KULA. The KULA was the trading expeditions that these people made. They went from island to island exchanging goods. What did they exchange? They exchanged apparently useless goods, arm shells and necklaces. And if I gave you, my KULA partner, an arm shell, you had to give me in exchange a necklace. And my trading partners in another direction, I gave necklaces to, and they gave me arm shells. So Malinowski describes the KULA in great detail. He fills you in on all the aspects of how the crews are recruiting, what magic they're using to make their boats safer. And people were taking big risks for these trips. Why were they doing it? What was going on here? And he says, how we've got a society, the Trobrians, without police, without law courts, how are people punished for antisocial behavior? And he says the punishment is that people break off these exchange relationships. So they are excluded more and more from society, sometimes temporarily, sometimes a longer term. So in Malinowski's latest study, exchanges or the exchange system is one of the main mechanisms for control of behavior. Understanding the functions behind customs like the KULA helped Malinowski to learn an even greater lesson, that he and his fellow Europeans had more in common with the Trobriand people than they had ever imagined. And so the final conclusion is people are pretty much the same everywhere.
And that's one of the things that I've been talking with you about all semester long, is that even though these rituals might seem strange or awkward or out of place, or maybe sometimes even immoral from our perspective, from their perspective, they have the exact same concerns. They have just come up with different responses based upon human creativity, environment, social control, where they live, the resources that are available. All humans around the planet have common concerns, different responses. The idea that everyone wants their children to be safe. Everyone wants a better life for their children. Everyone wants their children to feel the idea that they actually can be better in the future if they are willing to work hard. That's true almost everywhere we go. So it doesn't matter, as this video or as this slide shows, whether they're bands. So when we develop organized human civilizations, we almost develop always in this way. So we develop bands. Bands are nomadic food gatherers with limited political structure, 25 to 50 related individuals with limited private property and no specialization. All women in a band can do basically all female activities, and all men can do all male activities. From a Western perspective, these bands are extremely impoverished, but they're happier and they have more free time as they share. They're much more communal. Ironically, we are going to have in the rural Sepik River area of New Guinea, in the Polynesian, we are going to have some bands. Then generally the development of organized human civilization moves to tribes. Those are sedentary farming groups of a few hundred to a few thousand individuals. We generally have these a lot in the Native American tribes. That's why they're called tribes. They generally have a few status indicators based upon kinship types, age. And so we are going to see this also in Vanuatu and Polynesia. So Polynesia is one of the few places where all these things coexist at the same time over such a large geographic area. We're going to have chiefdoms with our large farming groups where status is institutionalized, important, and often inherited. This would be like the Mayan lords, but it's also like a lot of Oceanic chiefs and the Maori in New Zealand basically function. And then finally, states or empires that shows up, a centralized authority with a standing army or police to enforce basically any modern nation. And this is really what Hawaii ended up becoming right before Captain Cook and Western civilization. So Polynesia is one of the cool places, actually, not just Polynesia, but Oceania, where we can see all these different human developments at once. So when we think about Polynesia, we need to, or I'm sorry, when we think about Oceania, we need to divide it up into separate subgroups, separate geographic regions. And so generally there's a large triangle, and one we'll spend the most time on because Hawaii, our 50th state is here, is Polynesia. Polynesia basically goes all the way, so I'm not thrilled with this particular map, but the three quarters are going to be New Zealand, going all the way up to Hawaii. So it will include Tonga, American Samoa, Fiji, the Cook Islands. So New Zealand all the way up, Hawaii, over to Easter Island. Then we're going to have Melanesia, melamina dark. So these are the darker skinned individuals. And note, they're going to have larger land masses that show up, or New Caledonia, Fiji, where you can actually see them on a map outside of New Zealand and Hawaii, and specifically Papua New Guinea, this area of New Guinea over here. They're going to have a lot of resources. And then over here, we're going to have Micronesia up in this area right here. These are tiny little islands, not a lot of resources, very, very limited, Spartan detail. And so that's why it's called Micronesia. Now, when we look at oceanic landscapes, almost all of these are volcanic outcroppings. They are volcanoes that slowly created the land out of the sea. Eventually, as you can see, there's a coral atoll where the sediment showed up and got deposited out here, sometimes from the blowing off of the various lava formations coming out of the volcano. And this forms beautiful coral reefs and inland seas that show up here. And a lot of these will have black sand beaches. It's broken down volcanic ash. So here's us, my guys in a volcanic sand beach a few years ago when I taught a class in Hawaii. This is actually one of the earliest individuals ever to go surfing. Is actually Hawaiian. It's actually what chiefs and kings used to do. We can go horseback riding. Some of those beautiful ways to actually see. And so my wife and son love going horseback riding. And finally, here's me working with the Disney Oceanic Trust Working Group on Moana. And I'll show you an image and talk more about that later. Speaking of which, here's how we actually represented Polynesian culture process. Now, when we look at across Oceania, there are certain things that all oceanic cultures share. And here's three of their main artworks that show up, along with tattooing, which is the fourth. So pan-Oceanic arts, no matter whether you live in Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. First off, they're going to often have on the front of their canoes canoe prows. These often represent gods or very successful trading houses, and it's always projecting forward right on the water line. They're going to make bark cloth of the paper mulberry tree. This is going to be the dominant cloth and clothing that they have, even in terms of decorating their house. And we're going to have the idea of god figures, specifically the god of war in variations will be called Ku all across Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia. And the question then becomes, which is pretty remarkable, how did Polynesian wayfinders navigate the Pacific Ocean? And think about how difficult it is and how we get lost, even in roads with maps and navigation. In order to locate directions, they needed to know the motion of specific stars, so nighttime navigation. They needed to know weather patterns and where different weather. Think about how much the weather changes. They need to know wildlife species they would be seeing and different types of fish that just weren't in different waters. They would know all of this. Swells on the ocean as they came up. The crew would feel the motion of actually the swells and know where they were. The colors of the sea and the sky change depending upon depth and what's in the water, and how the clouds would cluster. They cluster different over large bodies of land than they do over open ocean. And so they started creating these wonderful maps, these star charts, and down here, a stick chart that actually has to do with the waves and how waves, where the little dots here are the little shells in particular, are land masses. And this is how water would flow from different currents around those land masses. So they'd be able to match up their chart with their Polynesian star chart, and that's how they navigated the world. So how an oceanic culture experienced the ocean, think about this. We look at this, or even I look at this, and I'm like, I'm gonna die. I'm in the middle of nowhere. And yet a Polynesian person can look and stick their hand in the water and look at the species and the birds and the star charts at night, and they can say, oh, this area right here, that's a flat, large animal below, most likely a whale. There's a fish school right here from the rib of the water. They know that the swell and the way that the shaping, oh, that means that Hawaii is this way. Swell here, oh, that's the current coming out of Tahiti, or that's headed. The flat is too small. It should be a higher peak here. That means there's a storm coming from this direction. And the swell that shows up right here, see this ridge that falls coming directly from this, that becomes, it's the Marquesas. If you actually go out to the ocean, really pay attention when you're out in the ocean and not just up against the coast where all the waves combine, you will note it's not flat, or the waves aren't all coming from one direction. There's a dominant direction, but then there are many, many directions. And the Polynesians, the Micronesians, the Melanesians, the oceanic cultures, this is how they navigated the world. And so if you get closer, they slowly change this with the stars as well, plus with the image we have before. And so as you look at this and this, you can say, all right, it's about 7 days travel to Hawaii in that direction. It's about 3 days to travel to the Marquesas Island in that direction. And they would literally be able to plan out within a day when they would be getting to different places, provided there was no storm putting them off course. And so this reads the entire idea into Moana that we were voyagers. The Polynesian cultures are voyagers. And so the connection to the water is remarkable for these individuals because the land is so limited, as we've seen on the map. Some of these islands you can barely see. They're difficult to find. So one of the early experiences, or one of the cool experiences, if you haven't done it here in the Miami area, in Hawaii is one of the great places to go surfing. We do a lot of the surfing competitions out there. And the cool Polynesian experience is learning to surf. So here's me. I was pretty awful at it. My lovely wife, who was actually pretty good at it. My daughter and my son, who was amazing, who actually was dapping on his first time going out. And you can actually learn how to surf in about an hour, and then just a matter of practicing the skills. It's tiring though, kind of constantly paddling out against the ocean wave as you go through. Now, as I mentioned, one of the dominant art forms that's going to show up are canoe prows. In the Solomon Islands, there is this individual here. And so this is called a musu musu. Note, musu musu is the name of the canoe prow only in the Solomon Islands. And so don't worry so much about the names, but more about the idea of a canoe prow. This is from the island of Melanesia. As I mentioned, they're from all over Oceania. So Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia. And this one represents their fishing god. Their fishing god is Kasoko. Or it might also, could be represent Kasoko, or a water spirit who protects them when they're out on these expeditions, because the weather is turbulent, right? Weather patterns change and can change the wave, and you could get off course by a day, so you re-find your bearing as it shows up. Note, he wears a European trade hat as a symbol of authority, of power, but also of the trade networks they have all the way with the other side of the world. He's going to have male face painting that we see here. Note, a forward projecting chin all the way out as the movement of the canoe prow through the water. Hands together, or sometimes holding a human head for sacrifice, really offering something to the gods, almost like prayer. And he's got an ear ornament that unmarried men and women both wore as an indicator that I'm single, rather than being up on Facebook and saying, relationship status. We'll see that there are war canoe prows all over Oceania. So here's one from the Maori from war canoe prow. We have one right here. And here's the musu musu. As you can see, they often will have a tongue sticking out, particularly the Maori, which is pretty amazing. So that would show bellicose, or the idea that this is a warring or aggressive people and not to mess with it. When we look at how these are made, here's actually an example of Polynesian woodworking. You can see the adzes and the axes that are being used even today. And tiki is a quick name of their gods. We often use tiki as an overarching nature for anything that shows up here, but tikis are actually images of Polynesian gods.
I apprenticed my father and my brother, older brother, and they've been carving for as long as I know them. One thing that I like about wood carving is it's good for the mind. I'm just in my own world when I'm carving. I learned all my techniques and my carvings from my older brother. He's one of the master carvers on the island of Maui. So one of my favorite specialties is carving the tiki faces. Every tiki represents something differently, depending on their eyes or their mouth. When their eyes are slanting down, it means good luck. When they have a smiley face, it means happiness. When the eyes are pointing up, it means protection. When the mouth is open, it means prosperity. And then when the tongue is sticking out, it means no fear.
And that's very different than the Maori conception, where the tongue out is aggressive, kind of to scare people away.
I really enjoy wood carving, and tiki carving is my specialty.
So the other feature that shows up all throughout Polynesia, and in different styles we'll see as well, same way that kind of the tongue sticking, even amongst the Polynesian people. In the Maori, that was aggressive. They do that during the haka dance we'll see later on today. But it basically means no fear within the Hawaiian community. Another art form that they do is called bark cloth. And bark cloth is basically how they make their clothes. It is the pounded bark of a paper mulberry tree. And here you see the plant and the flowers and the fruit. And so they pound that, and I'll show you a video on the creation of bark cloth. And then we'll talk about all the symbols that show up. So in different areas it's called mbugu. In some areas it's called tapa, T-A-P-A in Hawaii, for example. So here's the paper mulberry. This is how they make their clothes, some of their sails for their smaller ships. Right, there is no naturally growing cotton or anything. So they take the outer bark. You wrap the tree so as not to harm it, right? So that will solidify as well, so they can come back and harvest it in the future. As you'll notice as you look around outside of places in Honolulu, Hawaii, and other places, this is about the group that lives in the least amount of cities of any group will cover in this. Asians, a lot of those individuals have moved into different cities with the development into the kind of modern day states. We see that even in Africa, where people go to the village on weekends, which we'll see, but they often work outside of the village during the week. And here we have individuals that still live very close to nature in many contexts. You see they're slowly pounding it and adding water to soften it. If you're in class, I will bring in a piece of bark cloth for all of you to handle. It does get pretty soft. It's still a stiff fabric. And you can dry it out. If you pound two sheets together, you get rid of the holes because they'll actually absorb one another. And so when you do it, basically, the first thing you have to cut away the bark, which we saw. You have to split the back into strips. So you're going to see large strips, often done with the teeth still today or with a knife. You're going to beat the seams together. That's why this particular piece of bark cloth we saw had holes in it. We got to put the seams together, and then we're going to decorate, add designs and color from all sorts of different coloration that we see all over Polynesia. There's also design elements that we can actually pound into the cloth, as we'll see in Giving a Pound. So here are the patterns and what they mean. And they do refer to the local life that shows up. So for example, these are the kappa patterns, kappa being the name for bark cloth, or sometimes called tapa, T-A-P-A, or in this particular video, mbubu, because each place has their own language. And so kappa patterns of the national parks in Hawaii and American Samoa. So Hawaiian Parks National Association overall, they use this. This is the very top one, my cursor, but that very top one right here, then those are ocean waves, all the way in the upper left. Down here, if you look at this, these are peaks and valleys of mountains, specifically of volcanoes that show up. Down here, we're going to have food that actually sustains us. So this is actually going to be food that actually kind of like what we saw in the video Moana coconut. Down here, we have the idea of planning a strategy. So each one of these has a different symbolic nature that shows up. These are arrowheads. The nesting triangles here means living in harmony right next to one another without infringing upon each other's rights. This one is elongated overlapping rows. These are warriors, basically. Note, they are arrowheads, but all headed in one direction very quickly. So that's what we're looking at. Here's a background of the stars. Here are humans that show up down here, interlocking triangles. Here are birds and seagulls. And so you see these all over, so much so that we can identify different tapa styles, so the geography of bark cloth. If you ever see bark cloth that looks like this, so I'll test you. Next time I will be wearing a bark cloth shirt. So Hawaiian kappa is a repeating bamboo design that shows up here, the lines of bamboo showing up here. But note, it's got a pinkish coloration, which is almost very rare or almost non-existent in other parts of Polynesia or other parts of the Oceanics. Fijian is freehand stenciling. So you'll get a lot of overlap where the lines are not exactly perfect because the Fijians like the idea of freehanding and the artists get special skill to do that. In Tonga, we'll often see the coat of arms seen here on the Tongan flag will often appear. And Samoa, you'll note, rather than have freehand design with like flags and you're really going to get a repeating pattern in the Samoa freehand design that shows up. So they each, if you know what you're looking for, are actually different, but they're all bark cloth. So that's how we tell the difference from bark cloth. Now, you wear bark cloth all the time. You're born into it. You wear it for ceremonial occasions. There are different grades and qualities of bark cloth, of course, because we have a hierarchy that shows up in different aspects. Another feature that is pan-oceanic is the idea of warfare and headhunting. All of these individuals went out on what are called headhunting raids. Now, headhunting raids they just didn't do for headhunting, for murder or for warfare's sake that shows up, but when they felt that someone caused a problem within their own village, they would go on a headhunting raid. And generally, the death of a single warrior ended the headhunt. And so once one person was dead, it does mean that the other group is going to come back and probably try to avenge you unless they realize, yeah, we did that and that was wrong. And that's something that we should probably not have done. And so a group that actually has a warrior that was taken and whose head was decapitated in a battle might actually back down, not really back down, but say, yes, it was our fault, and particularly if it was that warrior that was beheaded. Otherwise, you want to avenge your dead individuals. And so, if you go into most of these earlier villages throughout Oceania, they will often have variations of skull racks of different individuals, of ancestors they've taken from other individuals, and also they will have ancestors of their great powerful figures all resting there almost as a way of kind of communing with the ancestors, theirs and their enemies. There is a vast tradition then of different really cool war clubs. Note they don't have the use of guns. And so because they're using clubs, the kill rate is going to be very, very low. Lots of broken bones until someone dies. And a lot of times the most common one, and these are all from Fiji, are going to be war clubs. So these war clubs are called, this one in particular, is called a totokai. And it's so famous, in fact, that it shows up in Star Wars. The Sand People note there's this totokai. This thing was a skull crusher. So this was actually meant for sacrificial victims or for people who were to be executed. It looks like the pandanus fruit, which is one of the supply chains that literally allows individuals to thrive. It lasts for weeks without rotting. So you take it on long ocean voyages. And it's got this sharp peak. And that sharp peak then would go right into your head, right into the brain, and it would kill you almost instantaneously for executions that show up. So this is particular from a tree that they would actually have to grow underground to make sure that they could get the curve in the bend. You can see how they artificially had to move the tree and keep shaping it within the process. So all of these bulbs then are different process or different shapes of different things from nature that they have that help survive them. And that heaviness is literally what they swing that allows war clubs. This down here is a knuckle duster from Hawaii. That knuckle duster shows up. You actually hold it with your hand right here. And then these are shark teeth. So it's a ripping, slashing, causes major damage within biting. So as we look at Hawaiian weapons, we still have Hawaiian weapon makers today, no surprise. Keeping up the traditional.
War, battles, combat in these islands can be traced far back to the first settlers. The islands of Hawaii were conquered by the most highly skilled fighters, Kamehameha I being the greatest warrior of all. The weapons they used were lethal, effective, and of course, handcrafted. Manny Matos recalls that part of Hawaii's history with weapons he handcrafts himself.
As a non-Hawaiian, native Hawaiian, I think I appreciate it a lot more because I strive to learn more about what is native Hawaiian.
He was born and raised on Oahu. He worked as a plumber during the early statehood years. At 29 years of age, he changed careers and became a policeman. There he met a fellow officer who introduced him to the art of weaponry. Manny moved to Big Island in the year 2000 and started crafting his collection using the buried woods of Hawaii.
Well, this piece here I have is a piece of mountain apple. I know mountain apple is not endemic, but the wood was so nice and very light, very soft. Weapons that were used were made out of the hard endemic wood like KULA, uhi, ala'a, even dryland koa. This particular piece here is made out of ko'u, A-O-U. According to Emerson's collection in the 1800s, it wasn't used for weaponry, for anything else, but mostly for eating. This particular piece here is it's made out of the wetland koa. It's all tiger shark teeth. The Native Hawaiians would utilize tiger shark teeth, great white teeth, the bull shark. They had developed this style of fighting unique within Polynesia. They were very tough, proud people, and they wanted to fight in close. They wanted to see the white of your eyes. But basically, it was hand-to-hand combat. This particular piece is the strangling cord. It was also the official form of execution. This is uhi uhi, one of my prized possessions. The teeth I used was the biggest tiger shark teeth, about 1 3/8.
Some weapons were multi-purpose.
It could be used to cut lauhala, to carve, and also as a hidden weapon. And very effective in close range. A lot of the women warriors would carry these, but they would fight alongside the men.
You know, that's an interesting
Men
feature that
and
we would have women
fought
fighting with
alongside
men,
each other.
which almost
Men
never
says
happened in other parts of the
war
world.
was not always part of the culture.
When the first Native Hawaiians came to Hawaii, there was no battle. There was no reason to battle. But somewhere along the line, some chief, as the story goes, came from Tahiti, and he brought along with that mentality of battle, ali'i, nobility, that type of, and it kind of changed the attitude. But prior to that, the Hawaiians were very peaceful people.
Here's a weapon that resembles a broadbill.
Sure. This would be strictly as a poho, as a tiger.
This weapon was a sacrificial knife.
What's really significant about this is the teeth. This is great white. A beautiful piece of great white. It's about 2 inches. And this kind of shows that the Native Hawaiians did hunt the great white. Okay, this particular piece also is Nihuleo Mano. This is one of the larger pieces. Really has a lot of teeth on it. I think it has 3, 6, 9, 12, 13 teeth on each side. This piece in combat wouldn't hold up as far as clubbing is concerned. These pieces were used by the older warriors because in battle they didn't want to get too close to the enemy, even if it was lying on the ground, because you never can tell what last effort they would make to. So they would use these longer weapons just to lean over and sever the jugular vein. This will be my signature piece, and I think the original piece was carried by an ali'i.
Manny gets his tiger shark teeth from a dealer in the Far East, but because of preservation laws, his supply will soon end. The wood comes from the Big Island when trees die naturally or from brush fires. He lashes with hemp twine in a very precise M pattern. His work is 90% historically correct. Because Manny is careful not to waste any piece of the log, he will reshape his dimensions to maximize its use.
And that is something that would have happened. And so in warfare, there were frequent warfare challenges. It generally happened until a single warrior died, and that would actually end the battle. And then the other side would go off. The losing side would leave, or if they go back to their village, if they were from that local area, they would have to decide if they were going to regroup. Was this a fair battle? Was the battle that took place? And so they're very aggressive with none of posture. All of them can fight, but it is hand-to-hand combat until we lose. Now, this is going to change later on in Polynesian culture. We start creating chiefdoms where you have to dominate entire other military. But early on, it is actually generally one-on-one combat. Now, for your exploits that you do, both in combat and not, the other aspect that shows up in Polynesian culture, actually all Oceanic cultures, is the traditional tattoo designs. And here are some various tattoo designs which are beautifully executed on human skin. So tattoos in Polynesia, Oceania in general, display a person's spiritual power and energy, their mana, the mana that flows through the universe, very similar to the Chinese concept of qi we talked about, that is contained everywhere. When a Polynesian person chooses to get a tattoo, they're doing more than simply picking a design they like here in the US. People in ancient Polynesia believed that they were stronger for the tattoos they had on their body. Why? It represented them, their actions, their social station in life, the hierarchy that showed up. And so here, it's harrowing, but here's actually how traditional tattoos were done.
We are able to look at our tattoo and remind us that this is where we came from, this is who we are, and these are the stories that define us as a people. This was like a rite of passage where you force this kid into some crazy shit. And then when he makes it out, it's like he's ready for the world. Tattooing is just one of those clever ways of making sure that traditions are never forgotten. There's
Depending upon where you are in Polynesia, it can actually show up anywhere on the body or the entire body.
When I first got into tattooing, like I wasn't really leaning to tattoo Polynesian artwork. I really didn't know much about it. It wasn't until my family started asking me for Polynesian tattoos, and I wanted to be able to understand the artwork that I was giving to them. I ended up learning more about my culture, and it kind of led me into becoming a Tufuna Tatau, tattooing traditional Samoan style. I was born in Eastern Samoa, but I grew up in Hawaii. Pursuing Polynesian tattooing, that was a comfort zone for me because I was familiar with the motifs and I could grab a hold of it because that was my first language.
I never sought out to be a Polynesian tattoo artist. When I first got into tattooing, I was doing gangster stuff on the West Coast. It wasn't until I had my son where I was like, man, you know what? I'm gonna try to be a professional. And that's when I hooked up with my very first tattoo job.
Polynesian tattooing is the artwork of the Oceanic people, the people of the Pacific. Polynesian tattooing is a body of work of different styles from different places. Hawaii, New Zealand, Samoa, Tonga, New Caledonia, parts of Fiji. That's a common belief that the word tattoo in our English language did come from the word tatau and came from the early visits by Captain Cook and those voyages. Those were some of the first people that recorded their experience with Polynesian people. So when they seen what we were doing and it was called tatau, the word transformed over time to tattoo. Tatau is the art of tattooing that's been practiced in Samoan culture for thousands of years. The traditional Polynesian tattoo starts from the mid-back and it goes down to below the knees, and it's very heavy, it's very linear with a lot of geometric shapes. All of our markings are tied to the earth. They represent plant life, animal life, oceans. We try to embody certain characteristics of these animals into ourselves. Probably one of the most widely seen shapes is the octopus tentacle. The octopus is a soft body, but it's one of the smartest animals in the ocean. It's also one of the strongest animals in the ocean. We see a lot of sea creatures in our tattoo works because that was the environment of our ancestors. They were natural voyagers. They went from each island and settled there, settled here. That's why you see so many ocean-based motifs. We have two tools, the sao sao and the owl. One hand I hold the owl and the other one with the sao sao, and we're just striking that into the skin. Our tools were made of woods that we found on the island, turtle shell for the backing, and horse tusks, which were filed and sharpened to create a tattoo comb that actually made the mark. Now, turtle shell is illegal, so we replaced that with plexiglass or fiberglass. The tufuna, or the tattooer, both his hands are occupied. So the role of the stretchers is to position the skin to where the tattooer is trying to implement his designs. The stretchers are called goso, au goso, or au solo. These are the men or sometimes women that help us out. Not only do they stretch the skin and hold it so that the tools can puncture and make their mark, but they also help soothe the person that's getting tattooed.
Being a koso is the beginning of the learning process of understanding the work that goes into it.
The ceremony that we do at the finishing of a tatau is called the sama. This is where we finish the work and we bless the tattoo. We rub the person that's recently tattooed with fonubu, with coconut oil and lenga to help the body heal.
It's a ceremony for the men who had the courage to go all the way through. When we tattoo people, we're not just doing the motion. It's some ancient shit. There's a lot of emotion and energy that goes into what we do.
One of the beautiful things about being over here is I get to work with a bunch of guys that are really passionate about what we do and the true meaning of our art form. Just to be able to share the art of Polynesian tattooing and the knowledge that keeps it sacred. Especially especially this far away from the islands that created our style.
What Polynesian tattooing means to me is a reconnection to all my ancestors and everybody behind me. Because I'm not only speaking for me, but I'm speaking for a whole generation of kids that are like me, that are getting Polynesian tattoos to reconnect.
And so as we look at Polynesian tattoos, depending upon where you are, you'll see there's variations amongst the islands as well. And so if we, for example, let's look at the tiki, the image of their gods. And so here are other representations. Note, you normally can pick out the two eyes and the nose and the mouth. So here is the most common version. But no, here's the eyes, the mouth, the nose. But you can actually show it as a side face, or you can show it in more abstract representations. The same is true here of Anata. Anata actually is the symbol of a human being. Note, Anata, this kind of wavy shape that shows up here, you can see it in multiple different ones. And two Anatas together are married. So like, it's very cool how you can play around. Ocean waves can almost look like music, particularly for individual, or like curls. And so these are the ones actually, I think these are the ones that are actually on the rock's body that we can look at later. Turtle then is the idea of long life and longevity, a powerful animal. So here's what we have, the variations that show up. We have lizard here and the various combinations. And then of course, shark teeth, which we see as a major tool. The tattooing tools then, depending upon where you are basically this. It's boar's tusk, at least tradition was boar's tusk, that you would pound in and break the skin, and it would have ink on it, so it would do everything at once, so you slowly bleed out within the process. It was considered so sacred that if you had tattoos, you couldn't actually, it was sacred, and the ritual behind it is that people would actually go on, and while they were healing, have feeding funnels so that the negative energy that could enter their body because there were holes in their body as it was healing would not get in and harm them. So people would actually feed them through a protective funnel to protect their mana while receiving facial tattoos. This is of the Maori, which we'll see from New Zealand. You can see here's the rock's body laid out, and there you can see actually the image of the tiki right here for protection, fertility of the gods that shows up. If you look at his tattoos over here, you'll note here we have that protection of the tiki. Down here, we're going to have the turtle for longevity, peace, rest. Down here is going to be a lizard for trying to protect yourself from bad luck and bad omens. Note you have the turtle for longevity above it. Then you actually have the various scrolls here. This is a scroll then that you see specifically of the ocean bubbles down here. We see this. These are shark teeth that are stylized going down. So in the idea of protection and strength and power that show up. Here's the ocean waves that you're writing on, two different versions of them. And so he's got like an arm sleeve that talks about all of his background from his Polynesian ancestry. When we look specifically at Polynesian then, versus some of the others, after we look at tattooing, Polynesian, basically, their artists focus on the attention on the hereditary elite. They have a power structure. So they're going to live more in the chiefdom realm when we talked about kind of villages and hunter-gatherers before, bands going into the idea of villages. They're going to live in the chiefdom realm. So they are going to believe in genealogy, the idea of passing on your ancestry to your children. And they're going to be talking about a transfer of a power called mana, which is all throughout Polynesia. The artists are often ritual specialists like tattoo artists, individuals that actually make images of the gods and tikis. The artworks almost always represent ancestors and gods. And throughout the centuries, warfare and ocean travel have been important to these Pacific islands. As they get larger and larger populations because they have more resources, they go out and they colonize other parts. And so some of the islands included in Polynesia are Hawaii, Tonga, Pitcairn, New Zealand, and surrounding islands, Fiji. One of the most famous things that shows up is the idea here of Hawaii, the northernmost island of Polynesia. So the northernmost part of that triangle with New Zealand and Easter Island over here is the following: the Mamaloa. And that is the law of the splintered paddle. And so when Kamehameha I was born, his older uncle, the child, killed. Instead, Kamehameha was given into the care of another princely family. And Kamehameha, which actually means the lonely one in Hawaii, he was called the lonely one because he suffered from depression. He was able to come back and use this time to reflect and united the lands for the first time under a single ruler. So he really does start kind of the chiefdom and the king moving from the chief area to the kingdom as he unites because he is a fantastic fighter. And so here's the law of Mamaloha right here. It's the first human rights law ever passed by the United Nations. The rights of people, so here's the Hawaiian. The rights of people, great and humble, may everyone from the old men and women to the children be free to go forth and lay in the road without fear of harm. Break this law and die. So basically it said that non-combatants in war, women, children, men who were fighting, the elderly, did not have to worry about being killed in war. Now this sounds crazy during the 19th century, but this is the first time we really ever established that law. Before this, women, men, children were kind of fair game, going all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. We talk about them being these wonderful civilizations. The Greek men and women and Roman men used to go in and frequently just rape and kill, rape the women and kill the children. It was kind of the victors and spoils of war. That's why you had to make sure that you had a good, solid military, because otherwise your family and you would suffer. His son, King Kamehameha II, is the individual that breaks a bunch of the tapu. Tapu is the word for forbidden, which is where we get the word taboo. In 1819, King Kamehameha II gave permission for men and women to eat together, which was never allowed before. This was a forbidden practice before this time because of the power of the mana differential. And to celebrate this, he hosted the first luau. That is the first luau. It's a co-ed meal sponsored by King Kamehameha, showing that men and women are more equivalent and more subject to the flow of mana than anyone had thought of before. And so as we go through here, the Kappa system and the Manu flow, so note there's a difference here now as we talk about Kapu and mana. In Polynesia, mana flows through matter. And so food could be an issue. People could be an issue. Animals could be an issue. Rocks could be an issue. And so you have to control your flow of mana. If you touch something with less mana, you give part of the mana to that less powerful substance. So if you really want to eat something that doesn't have as much mana, you have to have someone feed you that particular aspect. And that actually helps protect your flow of mana to keep you powerful. In Micronesia and Melanesia, mana is believed to flow through spirits. And so it's spirit contact, and it's the spiritual element. So two very different ways from the same large mass of groups. So an offense that is kapu or tapu, which basically means forbidden, was a threat to the idea that you might lose part of your spiritual power, your mana. So kapus were strictly enforced to control to make sure you didn't lose any of your mana. Because if you lose energy, you could get sick and die. So, for example, in different parts of the world, it was kapu to enter a chief's personal area. Only the chief or his immediate family was there. Only the chief was allowed to wear red and yellow feathers. That was a sign of royalty when we get to chiefdoms. And so only they had enough mana to be able to pull that off. It was also kapu or tapu for men and women to eat together. And King Kamehameha said that just does not make sense within the process. So it basically is the idea of how do ecosystems function today. Polynesia, with mana flowing through matter, is the idea of mass and energy. And Micronesia, mana flows through the spirits, is really kind of more like this energy force that shows up. But it's a spiritual energy, not an energy like carbohydrates or like calories. The creation myth of Hawaii then is interesting because it sets the standard of a lot of what we're looking at.
In the beginning, there was only endless darkness. Out of this darkness, two beings were born, the male Kumulipo, whose name means the essence of darkness, and the female Ho'ele, whose name means darkness itself. These two created all the creatures of the total darkness, the shellfish that live at the very bottom of the ocean floor, the plants that grow during the dark of night, and the grubs that burrow in the earth. As these creatures were born, the dark became slightly lighter. The first beings gave birth to the male Puli'uli, whose name means deep darkness, and the female Howehiwehi, whose name means darkness with a little light. This couple created all the creatures of the almost darkness. They created the fish that swim in the deep seas and land creatures that live almost in darkness. These dark creatures had offspring, and with every new life, the deep darkness of this world got a little brighter. The second couple gave birth to a third, the male Po'elele, whose name means night, and the female Pohaha, whose name means coming into dawn. These two created the creatures of the darkness near dawn, the insects that fly by night, the caterpillar, the grasshopper, and a large egg. The egg hatched into thousands of birds. These were the birds that fly and sing in the hours just before dawn. The fish, the birds, and the insects all had offspring. Each new creature added some light to the darkness, until it was getting closer to the light that we have in the hours before dawn. Next to be born were Ho'oponopono and Hulalowehi, who gave birth to sea turtles, lobsters, and other shellfish that live in shallow waters and near darkness. They gave birth to the male Po'hi'olo and the female Po'nea'aku. Their names mean night ending. They produced the rat Hilol and Kamapuya, the pig, both creatures of day and night. By this time it was almost dawn, and the earth was already buzzing with the light from so many creations. These two created the first dawn, and the light finally came into the world. The first man, Ki'i, and the first woman, La'ila'a, were born. They were both dark, since they were born just at dawn. The first man and first woman had many children. With each generation, their skins became lighter and lighter until they became the color they are now.
Now, what's interesting about this creation myth is that it explains not a lot just for Polynesian, but about how humans always need to have a rationale on where we're moving forward in the future. One of the things is even within biblical teachings, we have the idea of light versus dark, where dark is kind of more this evil light, because we're so used to using our eyesight to see and experience the world that in the darkness scares us. We have this idea of evil, and in the light is goodness, during the day. Horror films almost always take place at night, right? Romantic comedies happen during the day as you're falling in love with this beautiful light. Now, one of the great art forms that develops in all of Polynesia, and specifically for Hawaii, which is the masters of this, is going to be the idea of feathering. Feathered cloaks, specifically in feathered gods. So if we look up here, we have King Kamehameha first cloak. Remember, the person who unified all of Hawaii under basically a large chiefdom, which becomes an empire. Captain Cook was gifted a beautiful gift cloak, with his boat and the large sails here. Here are the water waves for King Kamehameha, and they would wrap around these two waterways, make another one of those loops. They would actually make Ku for the war god. The creation required 3 ritual specialists, a bird catcher, a binder using pigeon feathers to create the binding, and a bird featherer who attached all 150,000 feathers. So if you look at King Kamehameha's first feathered cloak, this right here, the red actually comes from the scarlet honey eater, and there are only 7 to 8 usable feathers on an entire scarlet eater. The yellow is yellow scarlet eater that shows up. So feather cloaks, helmets, capes, and garlands, which became feathered leis, later on flower leis, conveyed special status and prestige. They were for high-ranking individuals, and only they could wear these yellow and red colors. There was too much mana within them. Chiefs wore these cloaks into battles, and they're actually remarkably, because they're so tightly woven, they're remarkably able to accept hits without actually piercing the body. It would take 10,000 hours or 5 years of labor went into capturing of the birds and construction of the cloak, and 80,000 yellow and scarlet honey eaters for each cloak. I repeat, 80,000 yellow and scarlet honey eaters for each cloak. Hawaiian leis started as a royal feather gift for important visitors, and that's why we get the idea of those feather leis today, because we can't keep up with the bird trapping industry within this. Honey eaters' feathers were even used as money in currency rolls, so they became feather rolls that show up here. Now, here's featherwork preservation. You can see how close and beautiful they are.
Hawaiian featherwork has a very distinct quality. They were a symbol of the heavenly connection that the chiefs had, that connection to the divine. The birds that fly in the sky have that ability to connect with the ancestors and the gods. Of course, red being a very common color associated with the chiefly class, but the yellow colors, bright greens and blacks and other colors incorporated into Hawaiian featherwork really make it a very distinct art form. Red was the chief color for the elite class. Yellow also becomes very significant in Hawaiian culture because of the rarity and scarcity of that particular color and resource. The process of making Hawaiian featherwork is actually very labor intensive. It takes the farmers that go out and cultivate the materials, the fibers used to make the net backing, the people going up into the mountains to gather the feathers, and then the skilled craftsmen and artisans to actually assemble all of those materials together. The community showed their support in this way. There were different birds that were acquired that were combined together in the featherwork that connected the upland forest to the sea. So that idea of connecting space and time was visually evident in those chiefly garments. We want to continue those ideas of preservation and perpetuation of culture, honoring those individuals that make a difference in the community. And through the practice of featherwork, it really brought together those different resources together and supporting individuals and leadership and the community as a whole. The idea of maintaining these different practices isn't just, again, a preservation technique, but it's to remember those practices and make those practices relevant.
That's a king's helmet with a wave crest on top. And so one of the things that we want to be very clear as we talk about with the feather lays is that we often have this myth about these ancient cultures. And the myth that we often have about these cultures that don't live in a modern day technological marvel like we sometimes live in today is that these ancient cultures lived in harmony with their natural environments. And as you can see from the feather work here, we'll see the feather work from the Aztecs later on. We can look at this sculpture from ancient Greece was made out of 10,000 elephants that had to be slaughtered. So this is elephant ivory and gold. The truth is, ancient cultures exploited their environments to their full capabilities, but they just did not have the technology or the population. Remember, before clean running water and before antibiotics, disease, germs, virus, they killed us off very, very fast comparatively. And so we really couldn't create a large enough population in most areas until we get to much larger areas like the Greeks, the Aztecs, and the feather work actually out of Hawaii to actually make a group or another animal go extinct. Once we develop those tools and our population explodes, we absolutely take over and start doing much more damage on our environment. But it's because of our numbers. It's not because the ancient civilizations lived in peace and harmony with their environment. They did not. The one thing that I will say is that for most ancient cultures, they did use every part of the animal, which is different than us. We generally waste different parts of the animal, unlike what has happened actually in the ancient world. So that's one difference. But they didn't necessarily have been harmed. They just didn't have enough resources yet to dominate their environment. So you see these, when we see not just a feather headdress, but we will often see Kul, the Hawaiian war god. His name is actually Kuka Ili'imoku. So he generally has an enlarged head, as you see here. The circular, almost a circular 8 mouth that shows up, where he's got a ferocious expression, baring teeth, basically saying he's ready to fight. The fiber, this is Senate fiber, is considered fiber of the gods. It actually is very difficult fiber to work. And so you could make images of a god out of very real important materials. A hardwood for ritual wood, a Senate fiber mask, or out of feathers. And so you're going to see the overall athleticism through volume, treatment of the arms. Look, he's ripped, he's ready to fight, he's leaning forward. Gods were a part of everyday's life, regardless of their status. And the chiefs often invoke the gods to enforce their right to rule, to show you, look, I have the right to rule, and it comes to me from this staff, from this image, from the feathers, from the mana that I have that you don't have, to actually incorporate and make sure that all of our society, and to set the rules for all of society, because I have more mana than you. There are also places that protect you from the king's wrath if you can make it there in time. So one of the great national parks in Hawaii is Pu'ulohana, Ohanaanuna National Historic Park Traditional Village. It's a protection for all during times of war and when you break the kapu laws. If you make it here, as long as you stay here, it's kind of like going to a Roman Catholic church and you're like sanctuary if you've done something wrong, and the king not being able to get to you. So there are ways where you can actually go out and avoid a trial or an execution if you make it here. The problem is you can't leave here then. You have to stay within this national park, and this is where people who basically broke kapu would go to live. An individual actually, and you can see the tools here that are used to make wood in a traditional setting, where we have scrapers, largely woods and shell scrapers that show up. Wood, here he's actually making a serving bowl, a serving dish. Now, on the other end of the triangle, so if we have Hawaii up here, down here, one of the most famous things we have are moai. These are ancestral figures from the Easter Island from Polynesia. And note, most of them used to have a warrior's feather headdress, but not feathers. In this particular case, it would have been made out of rock that was actually placed on their heads. So these are huge, wonderful, megalithic stone sculpture on a very small island representing their ancestors, we believe. And so the Easter Island's human history, it really does begin with the settlement by Polynesians who actually brought things that they could actually grow and settle there. And so they generally bring bananas, taro, sweet potato, sugar cane, paper mulberry for their clothing, and chickens. And they actually thrive all throughout this environment, throughout the volcanic soil, which forms almost all of the islands here. If you don't know if you've ever taken a geology course before, this is sometimes called the Ring of Fire, where the volcanism shows up, and as the earth moves, the volcano keeps coming up until the land masses get larger and larger. Now, we are not sure who settled it. There are legends, speaks of the long ears here, who came from the east, maybe a pre-Incan ear extension, and short ears who came from the west, which would have been another Polynesian island, but there's nothing for thousands of miles. So you basically get to Fiji and Tonga on the other side of Polynesia. But remember, they did know how to navigate waterways. Oh, I should mention up here too. It's just called Easter Island, but really, the name of it was Rapa Nui. The only reason that it was actually called Easter Island is because it was found on Easter Day. So they called it Easter Island. We have a Christmas island for that same region in Polynesia. There are some unusual that show up. Overall, across the island, as you walk around, there are 600 different moais. Each one weighs 22,000 tons, and average height is about 35 feet tall. They're enormous. So they're as tall as your house. They're generally thought to be ancestral figures, and there are some that are unusual. Here's one that's called tukitori, which is actually a kneeling figure. So almost like in a prayer gesture, if we want to assume that, though we can't. There are still moai, more than 400, that remain, that are still in the ground, that have never been taken out. It's like they're there resting for all of eternity in various stages of construction. For whatever reason, they were never pulled out. We don't know if there was a cataclysmic thing that happened on the island. They stopped believing in the tradition, if they converted to Christianity. We have no notion of any of those things, but practically all of the moai later on, except for about 60, ended up being toppled by the native islanders themselves. So we don't know why that is. So there's some theories of Easter Island head movement. I won't actually go through that because I want to show you this. We've tried to do some different experiments because some of them are actually more than a mile away from the quarry. So how do you make the moai walk? Well, if you get a group and you tie it because they're so large on the surface, you can actually see we could make them walk pretty well forward. So local tradition says, and here's what the idea of walking. Local tradition says figures walked to their current place. Now walking, this might be the walking motion we're talking about. A 15-people team can move them pretty quickly, as you can see. The local language even has a specific verb for inching along without the use of leg. That might be the walking that we're talking about. It's a very unusual word to have in your language. There are some that have actually been toppled into the ocean. So if you go scuba diving around, there are 3 of them that you can actually see off the coast. And ancestral rites are still being performed today. Now, they're mostly done for a tourist thing because most people do not believe in the local ancestral rites anymore, but it is actually a tradition that you can actually go and experience. And so here it is. If you want to go what we call cultural playing or on a cultural tourism. So you can still do this in Easter Island and other parts of Polynesia, such as going to a luau today. to see what the experience is semi-like without getting all the religious connotations that go along with it. And rather than being voyeurs of watching this woman just get dressed, let's move to past the festival. So there's a fair amount of dancing that takes place. You'll note the feather work again. And you'll note this is not traditional. This is really more like cultural playing, but the idea of honoring the ancestors, but really in more of a communal celebration, a fun day, like the way we do July 4th, or the way most people do Memorial Day barbecue, rather than honor, the fallen warriors and really think about it, reflect upon them and their families. Or Veterans Day, we do the same thing. And so Easter Island celebrations, they still do take place on the beach than here in Rapa Nui today. All right, we'll save the rest of Polynesia for next time. And we'll go through the end of Polynesia, our third island of the triangle, where we've already actually looked at Hawaii all the way in the northern corner. Down here then, as we look, we would have Easter Island be right here, Hawaii all the way up here. We're gonna have all the way really over here. It's gonna be the Maori of New Zealand. So that forms the large scale triangle that we have. We've also talked about some artwork, then that's pan-Oceania, right? The idea of tattooing, the idea of bark cloth, the canoe prows that show up. And so there are certain things that actually are used as cultural goods, and how their decorating is different. So next time we'll look at the two other areas, Micronesia, where there's not a lot of art and where there's very limited material. So we're going to see a lot of things used with mud and feathers, natural elements that are around. And Melanesia, which actually has many of the same traditions as Polynesia, but just with different materials and reasons why. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye.